Let me be direct with you from the outset. What we are witnessing from Moscow this week is not diplomatic posturing. It is not the opening move in a negotiation process. What we are witnessing is Russia publicly dismissing NATO's third request for negotiations in 6 months, and the reasons for that dismissal reveal more about the current state of the conflict than any official NATO statement ever could. I am looking at the transcript of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's press conference from May 12th. What it contains is not diplomatic equivocation. It is not the careful language of someone leaving room for future dialogue. What it contains is a systematic rejection of NATO's negotiating framework and a clear statement that Russia sees no value in discussions under current conditions. The specific phrase Lavrov used, translated directly from Russian, was that NATO is again asking for negotiations from a position of weakness while pretending to negotiate from strength. In the next 19 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why NATO is requesting negotiations, why Russia is rejecting those requests, and what this dynamic tells us about the actual military and strategic situation on the ground. This is Daily Brief. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being analyzed in classified intelligence briefings, and you are not getting this perspective from Western media coverage. Let's start with the timeline, because understanding when NATO made these requests and what was happening militarily at each point reveals the pattern. The first negotiation request came on January 18, 2026. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg proposed what he called a framework for sustainable peace negotiations. Russia responded within 48 hours, rejecting the proposal, stating that NATO's framework did not address fundamental Russian security concerns. The second request came on March 22nd. This time, it was a joint statement from the foreign ministers of Germany, France, and Poland, offering to mediate direct talks between Russia and Ukraine with NATO involvement. Russia responded by stating that any negotiations must begin with recognition of territorial realities on the ground and withdrawal of Western military support for Ukraine. The third request, the one Lavrov just rejected, came on May 10th. This time, it was a more direct approach. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and NATO officials proposed immediate ceasefire negotiations without preconditions. Russia's rejection was even more emphatic than the previous two. According to reporting by multiple sources familiar with the Russian government's internal discussions, Moscow views these repeated negotiation requests not as genuine peace initiatives, but as tactical maneuvers designed to achieve through diplomacy what NATO has failed to achieve militarily. The assessment in the Kremlin is that NATO wants negotiations because the current trajectory on the battlefield favors Russia, not because NATO has suddenly developed interest in sustainable peace. Subscribe if you are starting to understand that this is not about whether both sides want peace, it is about whether they agree on the terms under which peace is possible. Now let's talk about what has actually changed militarily between January and May that explains why NATO's negotiating position has gotten weaker with each request. Announcement number 1, the artillery mathematics. And this one matters because it reveals the fundamental resource imbalance that is driving NATO's diplomatic urgency. In January, Ukraine was firing approximately 6,000 to 7,500 artillery rounds per day, according to estimates from the Royal United Services Institute. By March, that number had declined to 4,200 to 5,300 rounds per day. By early May, Ukrainian artillery fire rates have dropped to approximately 2,800 to 3,500 rounds per day. That is a 50 to 60% reduction in just 4 months. Russia, meanwhile, has maintained artillery fire rates between 40,000 and 60,000 rounds per day throughout the same period. That is a 12 to 1 or 15 to 1 advantage in artillery volume. Artillery dominance in modern warfare translates directly to territorial control and casualty ratios. When one side can deliver 15 shells for every one the opponent fires, defensive positions become untenable. The decline in Ukrainian artillery capacity is not a tactical choice. It is a supply chain crisis. Western countries committed to providing artillery ammunition to Ukraine, but production has not scaled to match consumption. The United States produces approximately 28,150 mm artillery rounds per month, according to the most recent Department of Defense figures. Ukraine is consuming roughly 84,000 to 105,000 rounds per month at current reduced fire rates. Even if every American-produced shell went directly to Ukraine, which is not possible, it would not close the gap. European production adds perhaps another 25,000 to 35,000 rounds per month. Combined Western production is approximately half of what Ukraine needs to maintain even the current reduced artillery tempo. To match Russian fire rates would require production increases of 800 to 1,000%, which is industrially and financially impossible in any relevant time frame. General Mark Milley, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stated in a closed congressional testimony in April that was subsequently leaked to the press, and I am quoting directly, that the ammunition production deficit is the single most critical constraint on Ukraine's military effectiveness and represents a strategic failure of Western industrial mobilization. That is a serving general telling Congress that NATO cannot sustain the war at current intensity. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the manpower crisis. This is the issue that almost no Western media outlet is covering honestly, and it is arguably more important than ammunition shortages. Ukraine implemented its 4th mobilization wave in March 2026. The mobilization age was lowered from 27 to 25. Exemptions were reduced. Enforcement was intensified. Despite these measures, Ukraine is struggling to maintain force levels sufficient to hold current defensive lines, let alone conduct offensive operations. According to data from Ukrainian military recruitment centers compiled by independent researchers and confirmed by multiple sources, monthly recruitment in April was approximately 18,000 to 23,000 personnel. Estimated Ukrainian casualties, killed and wounded requiring more than 30 days to return to duty, are running between 25,000 and 35,000 per month, based on analysis of casualty evacuation patterns and hospital admissions. That mathematics is unsustainable. If you are losing more personnel each month than you can recruit, your army is shrinking. A shrinking army must contract its defensive lines or accept lower force density, which makes breakthroughs more likely. Either option favors the attacker. Russia, with a population 5 times larger than Ukraine, and a mobilization system that has been running since September 2022, does not face comparable manpower constraints. Russian force levels in the theater have remained stable or grown slightly over the past 6 months, despite ongoing casualties. Stay with me because this is where the diplomatic pattern becomes clear, and where NATO's repeated negotiation requests reveal strategic desperation rather than peace initiative. Each time NATO has requested negotiations over the past 6 months, it has coincided with a deterioration in Ukraine's military position. The January request came after Russia captured Avdiivka, a fortified position Ukraine had held since 2014. The March request came during a Russian offensive that gained approximately 340 square kilometers of territory in 3 weeks. The May request comes as Russia is advancing toward Chasiv Yar, a logistics hub whose loss would compromise Ukrainian defensive coherence across a 60-kilometer front. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. NATO requests negotiations when battlefield momentum favors Russia, presumably hoping to freeze territorial gains before they become irreversible. Russia rejects negotiations for the same reason, seeing no incentive to accept a ceasefire when the military trajectory favors continued operations. Sergei Lavrov stated explicitly in his May 12th press conference, and I am translating his exact words, that Russia will not reward Ukrainian and NATO military failures with diplomatic concessions. If NATO wants negotiations, the starting point is recognition of realities on the ground, not fantasies about returning to 2014 or 2022 borders. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this one explains why Western media coverage and official statements have diverged so dramatically from the actual situation. There is a fundamental disconnect between what Western officials say publicly and what they say privately. Publicly, NATO officials and Ukrainian leadership talk about reconquering territory, restoring 1991 borders, and achieving total victory. Privately, according to multiple sources in European governments and leaked US intelligence assessments, the consensus is that Ukraine cannot achieve these objectives militarily, and that the best realistic outcome is negotiating a ceasefire that preserves some portion of Ukrainian territory and sovereignty. The problem is that public statements have created expectations that cannot be met, which makes it politically difficult for Western leaders to propose realistic negotiating positions. Any proposal that involves Ukrainian territorial concessions is characterized as capitulation or appeasement, even when military realities make such concessions inevitable. The result is what we are seeing now. NATO requests negotiations without being able to offer terms that Russia would accept, because offering realistic terms would require admitting that Western policy has failed. Russia rejects negotiations knowing that NATO cannot offer anything valuable enough to justify halting operations when battlefield trends are favorable. According to reporting from Der Spiegel, citing unnamed German government sources, Chancellor Scholz privately told coalition partners in April that Ukraine's military position is not sustainable without dramatic increases in Western support that are not politically or economically feasible. That assessment has not been stated publicly because it would undermine Ukrainian morale and create political problems for governments that have invested enormous resources in supporting Ukraine. Now let's talk about what Russia is actually demanding and why those demands are non-starters for NATO under current political conditions. Russia has stated repeatedly and publicly that any negotiations must begin with recognition of territorial annexations of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson oblasts. Russia demands Ukrainian neutrality, meaning no NATO membership and severe restrictions on military capabilities. Russia demands lifting of Western sanctions. Russia demands prosecution of what it calls war criminals in the Ukrainian government and military. From a Western perspective, these demands are absurd, imperialistic, and completely unacceptable. From a Russian perspective, these are the minimum requirements that justify the costs Russia has absorbed during the conflict. The gap between these positions is unbridgeable under current conditions, which is precisely why Russia sees no value in negotiations. If you are following this conflict in Western media, you are getting a fundamentally incomplete picture. You are being told that Russia is suffering catastrophic losses, that the Russian economy is collapsing, that Russian military capabilities are degraded, and that Ukraine is heroically defending democracy. Some of those claims contain elements of truth. Russia has suffered significant casualties. The Russian economy faces challenges, but the overall narrative omits critical information about Ukrainian losses, Western industrial limitations, and shifting battlefield momentum. This pattern has historical precedents, and the lesson is always the same. When one side in a conflict is losing militarily, but maintains domestic political narratives of impending victory, that side often finds itself unable to negotiate effectively because any realistic settlement contradicts the public narrative. The Vietnam War provides a clear parallel. The United States military was not defeated in any decisive battle. American forces won most tactical engagements, but the strategic position was unsustainable. The US was losing politically in Vietnam, diplomatically internationally, and domestically in American public opinion. Yet official US rhetoric throughout the war maintained that victory was achievable, that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, that one more escalation would break their will. That rhetoric made it politically impossible for US leaders to negotiate realistic terms until after years of additional fighting had made the political costs unbearable. The result was a negotiated settlement in 1973 that could have been achieved in 1968 or 1969 if US leaders had been able to acknowledge realities earlier. NATO and Ukraine face a similar dynamic today. The public narrative of Ukrainian victory is so entrenched that proposing realistic negotiations would require admitting that the narrative was wrong. That admission carries enormous political costs, so Western leaders continue requesting negotiations without being able to offer terms that Russia would accept. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 paths forward, because what happens in the next 6 months will determine whether this conflict ends through negotiation or through military resolution. Path 1. Reality acknowledgement. Western leaders begin preparing domestic populations for realistic negotiations that involve territorial compromises and Ukrainian neutrality. This happens gradually through carefully managed public messaging. Negotiations begin within 3 to 6 months based on territorial control at that time. I assess this as 30% probability because the political costs of such messaging are enormous. Path 2. Continued stalemate degrading into Ukrainian collapse. NATO continues requesting negotiations while being unable to offer acceptable terms. Russia continues military operations, achieving incremental gains. Ukrainian military capacity continues degrading. Eventually, Ukrainian defensive coherence fails, and Russia achieves military objectives without needing to negotiate. This is 50% probability because it is the default trajectory if nothing changes. Path 3. Western escalation. NATO countries decide that allowing Ukrainian defeat is politically unacceptable and dramatically increase military support despite economic and political costs. This restabilizes Ukrainian military position and creates conditions for negotiations from relative strength. This is 20% probability because it requires levels of Western commitment that public opinion and economic conditions may not support. I think we are on path 2. The repeated negotiation requests suggest NATO recognizes the current trajectory is unsustainable. But the inability to offer realistic terms suggests Western leaders have not yet prepared their populations for the compromises that negotiations would require. Russia's repeated rejections indicate confidence that time is on their side militarily. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, at what point does Ukrainian military degradation become severe enough that Western leaders have no choice but to pursue realistic negotiations, regardless of political costs? Second, what would Russia demand beyond current stated terms if Ukraine's position deteriorates further? Third, can Western industrial production scale sufficiently to change the military balance, and what would that require in terms of economic mobilization? Tell me in the comments whether you think NATO's negotiation requests are genuine peace initiatives or tactical maneuvers. Tell me if you believe Western media coverage accurately represents the military situation, or if there is systematic bias in reporting. We will keep tracking battlefield developments, diplomatic initiatives, and Western industrial mobilization efforts. That is what Daily Brief does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone who wants to understand what is actually happening beyond official narratives and media talking points. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.